All right, thank you. Hey, how are you? Two comes. Where are you? This thing.
Right on time. We're over. Yeah, exactly. Good. All right, that works. And how do I start this? Oh, yeah. Oh, and I need a TV. I'm going to wear a dark shirt today because chroma key behind me, the blue that I was wearing.
Oh, yeah.
My head would be floating there. You can't hear me yet. Maybe I just move this a little bit. Can you hear me when I speak directly into it? We've got mic levels. Check your side because I've got mic levels over here. Hear me then I. Okay, great. Well, let's get started. We've got a long day ahead of us. Meaning that I'll be doing the breakout as well, and really this is just one long lecture split into two. I've decided to try and build a project and spend the afternoon whatever we do. And so that encourages questions because there's no real, I mean, there's a schedule we need to be on in order to get kind of the end, show all these concepts that I want to show, but we have 3 hours to do it, so it's a little bit nicer than having to. Okay, so let's talk about React because we've got some objectives today, and these are the major areas of React that I want to talk about. So components, this is about taking our UI, breaking it up into little pieces, then putting those pieces back together to build an interface out of. So things that would fall under the category of components could be anything really, any sort of section of your page, and normally we have components that contain other components, and those components contain components of their own. So we have a hierarchy of some sort. And so you could have a button component that wraps up the button tag. You could have a component that represents an entire page. You could have a component that represents a list of things. There's lots of different options here. The way that we make those components useful to us is through the passage of data. So we pass data into those components as what we call props. I assume it stands for properties. Long for you. And so props, that makes sense. Nice, we don't have to type properties out every time. And then the other part about props is, or I guess the other piece is state. So components can also contain state within themselves, and that allows us just to keep track of some things, life cycle of that component. Components, so flow of data, this would be that we can only ever pass data into components. Components can't really, they can call functions that are passed to them, but they can't, no way for them to, for example, access other components' props directly, or access state from within a component. So I'll show a diagram of a tree, but you'll see that we pass data down through that tree. So that typical way we talk about this is data down, pass data down only. One of the things that makes React a little different from other front-end libraries, like Angular, for example. So we have one-way data binding, passed down through the chain into components. And then events, this allows us to handle interactivity. Just like with the DOM, we can things like clicks and mouse moves. We do that in React as well. Respond to those things, and we can change our data based on things that happen. Before we get into React, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we should approach development in general. So I've come up with this idea of maybe doing Tweeter as a React app. So this should be familiar to people in terms of the requirements are very similar. We have a way to input tweets. We post those tweets. If we put a tweet that's not correct in, either it's too short or too long, we warn the user about that. And we do not let them post it. We have a list of tweets that shows all the tweets that have been posted so far. Yeah, it's simple things like that, but still, same application, different implementation, new technology. I start off by creating a wireframe. So I do this when I'm building any app. I build a wireframe, and with that wireframe, I sort of try to make as many decisions as I can, as early as I can, as inexpensively as I can. And once I have a pretty good idea of how I want to structure my data, then I take it into another piece of software. The one I use is called Sketch. It could be really any visual design tool. And I apply a style to it. I choose the colors, I choose the fonts, I choose whether or not corners are rounded, I put icons in there, that type of stuff. So I'll show you quickly what Sketch could look like. Pretty straightforward application, and it allows me to do things like move text around, change the color of things, I can choose different fonts. So this way I get a pretty good idea of what I want the app to actually look like without ever having to write a line of code. And you probably won't do this. You'll probably jump right into the code, final project. But I'll remind you when you start to struggle, CSS or the structure or whatever, this is the reason I do it, is because when I have a pretty good idea of what the overall thing should look like, I get to make better decisions about each of the pieces inside of it. And so from a sketch, I'm still not done. I'm still not ready just to start building a React app at this point. Because what I want to do is I want to actually mock this up in HTML. I want to forget about the fact that we're using a front-end framework, and I want to build a static structure and the styles that apply to that in CSS, in HTML, as a single HTML page. So that would be what I have on the right side there. It's a screenshot of a piece of HTML that I wrote. Styles apply to it. And that looks like, well, exactly what you would expect it to look like, which is in my design folder here, I've got the layout that was given that I output from Sketch. This is just a standard PNG image. Then I've got layout.html here. Layout.html uses images and CSS that I provided to it. And this is what it looks like by HTML, just HTML. If I go look at the page source, the structure of my application, kind of similar to what we've done with Chatty when it started on that. The idea is that we create the structure of the HTML. Then we're going to take the pieces of this and we're going to copy and paste these in as components. We're going to break this up into different components in React. And it's a lot easier to do that once you have a pretty good idea of HTML structure. So that's our goal today. And I guess I should quickly talk about this. So this is kind of what I mean by breaking it into components. I have these different areas of my site, my page, right? I have a header, and this could contain other subcomponents if I wanted to. A button, perhaps, maybe a status bar, a header, some sort of an input. Well, those could all be broken down into further components. I have this thing called a series. Now, this could be a list, it could be a series, it could be called anything with that type of. But the idea is that this represents a list of similar elements with different data in each of the elements. So what I would end up with, what I'd start with is an array of objects, each object representing a tweet. And I want to convert that into an array or a list of posts that people can see visually. And so then I also define the actual component, the post component, separately. And my series is simply responsible for taking that data and passing each of the items in the array to a separate post component that then understands how to render out the name, the date, the content, and avatar, for example. Yeah. The structure of the app is important to kind of understand, and this is very similar to when we're building stuff in HTML, is that we still have a tree we're dealing with. So in this case, I have a high-level app component. This is the thing that houses, it's the starting point. It houses all of my other components. And within that app, there are two child components. One is called a header, and one is called main. Header would be that top half. Main is going to be that second half. And within main, we're going to put a post series component, again, that understands how to convert an array of objects into a list of posts or tweets. And each of those posts in the series are actually a separate post component. I have those repeat relevant to the number of, I guess, messages I have in my array. That all make sense so far? Again, this is just an overview. We're going to get into coding after this. Props and state. So I've sent out some reading. People have looked a little bit into React yesterday. What's the major difference between props and state? You can read this to me. Yeah, and let's remember this, right? So a React component cannot change its props. This is really important to understand. Is that if props are passed into a component, the component has access to it, can use those props, but we can never change those values. We don't get to reassign values. New props will come in all the time from other components, but when those props are inside of a component, we do not change them. Or if we do, what's the point? Because our component will not react to it, not render as a result of that. Okay, so that's props. Props come in from outside only, and they are passed into a component from a parent, I guess. So state, how is it different? It's the opposite. It's what gives us the ability to store things. So when something does change within our component and we want to keep track of that, we use state. And the thing about state is that nothing outside of our component has access to the state within a component. So while a component can be passed props from outside, it cannot be passed state from outside. It can be passed props that you can set as state, but the state itself exists with only inside of the component. No one else has access to it. So this is the main thing we want to remember when it comes to props and state. Major difference in how we decide how we use these things. Okay. So what's the difference between props and state? Okay, you don't have to say it. We'll talk about it a lot more as we get into some more details. So once we have props and state, so this component has some data, the idea is that we want to render that data. And we want to render it every time it changes. Because the way that React works is we provide some data, and we run it through a function called render. And that render function declares the way that the UI will look. Declares the state of the HTML, or I guess the rendered state of the HTML DOM. Okay? And we use the React component lifecycle. This is a number of different functions that are provided to us inside of a component that will be called by the React library for us at certain points in time. I'd say milestones in the life of a component. These typically fall into three categories of a life: the creation of that, the updating of that component, and it's something where components live most of the time is in the update phase. The destruction of a component when it goes away. So these methods that I've listed on the right side here, they allow us to hook into these different phases. So when a component is created, its constructor will be called. It's the first method that would be called on a component, and we can do things inside of there that need to be done when a component is initialized before it's rendered the first time. For example, we could set initial state here. There is a render method that's called on creation. I mean, it's the first render that's called. It's the initial render for a component. And then there's a method that's called component did mount that's triggered by the React library as soon as the DOM is ready to go. This is similar to that ready method in jQuery in the sense that it's telling us that our component has now been mounted, all of its children have been mounted, and now it's ready to be manipulated in some way or another. Okay? So we got component did mount that we're going to be using today. And then we're sitting in an update phase. So at that point, the component's kind of sitting there, waiting for things to change. And when something changes, props or state, which are the things that change in a component for the most part, then this sequence of components or methods will be called as well, including a re-render. That's what causes our UI to change. Props or state change, and we do this correctly, then the render will be called, and then the DOM will be changed, and now our UI will look different than it did before. And if we change the props and state again, then it goes through this life cycle again. Render will be called, and now we have new DOM that represents the new state of our application. And this is sort of this is what we want to be focusing on. Change the state, render the DOM based on that state. Change the state, render the DOM based on that state, and do it on a component by component basis. Represent our UI. For destroy, you won't have to really worry about that right now. Know that it exists. You won't need to use it for the app that you're building this week. But there's cases where when a component goes away, when a component is removed, there's things that we want to do before we finish removing the component. Things like, well, what's a good example? I mean, in a few days, I can tell you about sockets and about how we might want, if we make a socket connection when a component mounts, we might want to disconnect from that socket when the component goes away. For that, we would use a component will on mount call, where we would define that function, and React would call it for us before the component was gone, and we'd do anything that needed to be done before the app was sort of taken away from us. I've broken down into sort of these vertical slices, so the flow of these calls is as I've described it, but I like to use this representation a little bit more when talking about it. So when a component is mounted, it can have initial state and it can have default props. So in the case that a property is not passed in that we need to use, we could define a default for that property. And then when someone passes in an actual prop with that name, we don't use the default anymore, whatever was passed into. We also have initial state. Like what's the initial values of this data of this component? And this is the state that would be used for the initial render. So we end up going from we set the initial state, we set the default props in the constructor perhaps, and component will mount is called. We're not ready yet, but we're about to mount the component. The render gets called, which could actually load up a number of different child components. Right? So if I'm going to show you a list of posts, that component gets mounted. And when it renders, it actually declares that there are child posts for that component. Well, all of those components have to have their render method called before we get back before we get back to the parent. Okay. So I think here, if I call render in post, if render is called in post series the very first time, it's going to actually say that there are, let's say, 5 different post components inside of that as children. Well, each of those post components, their render method will be called. And if they don't have children, then that render method will complete, and we will get component did mount for the posts. And then we'll come up to post series, and then the render will be finished there. And now we'll get component did mount for that post series component. So all the children have to be rendered before the parent finishes, okay, or before its did mount all is done. Not super important that we know this right now, but just think of the hierarchy in all cases. Hierarchy is very important. When we're updating, there's a number of different calls, including one here called should component update. So we have the ability to prevent a component from updating. If we return false from this method that we define ourselves, should component update, we return false. It will never update this component. But we can do it optionally. We can say, in these circumstances, don't re-render this component. So that gives us a little bit more power over the life cycle that we're doing. So we might decide at some point that if this prop is changed, we don't really care if it renders right now. But this prop, we definitely need to make sure that renders changes. So we can tie in and do a little bit of advanced functionality there. Again, we won't need that for Chatty app, but the ability is there. React goes much farther than what. And I want to really focus on the easier stuff, on the basics. Week, then we can build off of that coming week. prove. When I say there's a render method called, usually it follows this pattern. I set the state, it renders. 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 It happens over. Typically what a component is live. Set state is actually a method that's provided to us by React in every component. Some rules that we want to follow when we're dealing with state. The major one is that we do not modify the state directly. So here I have my this.state object, which React provides to me. And I define a key on there called posts. And this is an array. It represents all the tweets in my app at this point in time. If I want to assign a value to posts, I don't just assign a value. Because if I do that, it will not re-render my component. It does not know that things have changed. By simply just assigning a value to posts, it can't tell that we've actually changed the state. So instead what we do is we say we're not going to modify state directly. What we do is we pass state to this method setState. And then it knows that it can modify the state and then trigger a re-render for us. We have to use this method in order to modify the state. Yes? Not necessarily. I could pass an empty array. So let's say that I wanted to clear out my list of posts. I didn't want them to show anymore. The best way to do that is to set the array to be empty. And then it'll just render an empty array of posts, which ends up not running a lot of code, right? So instead, I mean, I could say post null. But then there's a point where my app is going to go and try and map over my posts and create components out of it. So I can't map over a null property. So my preference is to say that lists of things like arrays, they're empty. They're just empty arrays when they don't have any value. Yeah. Okay, so we passed this object, and this object could have a number of different keys in it if you feel like it. So in this case, I'm only modifying one piece of state. But if I wanted to modify 2 or 3 pieces of state, for example, maybe a username or something, I could put right in here posts colon array comma username colon, and I can just, like any object, I can pass multiple key value pairs. And each of those keys should represent a piece of state in our application. Each of the values are going to be the value for that point. Okay? So don't modify state directly. And I mean, when I say don't modify it directly, I mean after the initial state. Don't try and change the state using assignment. Use the setState method. So here, it looks like I'm modifying state directly, but this is the constructor. So this is actually how I'm defining the initial state of the application. Is I set the state here to be an object that has values content and error in it. So this will actually be a constructor that I would use in my header to define the content that is currently typed into my tweet box, and then also an error that would be shown in the status bar if someone typed in something longer or too short. So here I would set the initial state, and then when an error is triggered, when a function is called to trigger an error, I would set the state of the error to be the message that was passed into that function, and then that would cause a re-render of my application. And now that the error actually has a value, that would be represented somewhere in my DOM. Okay? And what you'll notice here is that even though my state has content and error in it, I didn't pass content into it here. And it did not overwrite it. That's important. That state updates are merged. That I don't pass it an entire new state every time. I pass it just the pieces that I want it to change. And it's smart enough to go through that new thing and only replace the pieces that it needs to. So in this case, I have content and error. Error message is the only one that's going to be replaced. Content will still be empty. If I passed in error message and content, then it would replace both of those pieces. So state updates are merged. I pass just the part I want to change. Everything else will just remain what it was. State updates may be asynchronous. We can't necessarily do this.setState and then use state immediately afterwards. Expect it to be what we changed it to. Okay? There's ways to handle this. There's ways to do callbacks. There's special signatures for set state, where here I'm doing set state with an object. We do have the ability to pass it a function if we wanted to use it asynchronously. I'm not going to get into the details of this because in the past when I've tried to, it feels like it's just a little too much on the first day. But I just want to point out that state updates are asynchronous. We need to keep this in mind. And we probably will not run into any issues with that with Chatty at all this week. Okay? I've only run into issues with this a handful of times in my own applications. It's not something that I worry about a lot. But then when something happens, I do need to know that state updates are asynchronous, and I need to spend a little bit more time thinking about how I'm going to deal with that. If you have questions about this in detail, I can show you examples of that. But for now, to save time, I'm not going to go too deep. But I really recommend the React documentation. I find it to be really good. One of the things that it has is a better explanation of the asynchronous nature here. Here we go. So I've taken this stuff right out of it. Do not modify state directly. And state updates are merged. So I did it out of order because I felt like those were the two most important things, right? We don't update state directly, and we don't, and the state updates are merged. So here, this part about states being asynchronous, read that if you want to advance a little bit more. Okay? But know that it exists. Know that it's there. What I want. That's the message I want to get across. Can't just call set state and then expect our state to be set immediately. And actually, if we called set state 12 times in a row in the same function, it would actually batch all those changes and result only in a single render for performance consideration. We don't want to render 10 times if the data only really changes once over within that second, that frame or whatever. So calling set state many times could result in a batched update, meaning a single render as a result. But again, that fits into this kind of complex part of set state. When set state does not have to be that complex 99% of the flow of data. So what I said is that data flows one way. I meant it, and this is kind of what it looks like when it comes to our hierarchy. So I'll be coming back to this. This is an important diagram for my application that I'm planning, because I need to decide where this state goes, which component owns the state, and which components pass that state as props, other components, so that we can essentially, I guess, give the components what they need to display what they need in the call. So for this, our app has a state. The state of the app includes an array of posts. They're all the tweets that are currently existing in the application. And the app has a child header, and the app has a child main. So I'll start with main, and I'll continue down, and I'll say that the app will pass all of those posts to main as an array, as props called posts, passing that data right down to the next child. Because we know that the post series ultimately needs that data, but we won't store the state there. We'll store the state in the app so that it's easier to change and share amongst many children. But for post series, it needs that array. So what we do is we pass it from app to main, then from main to post series. Post series will then go through that array, and for each item in the array, we'll render a different post component. And for each of those posts, we're going to give it content, date, likes, and a user object, for example. That would be the data that each post needs to have. So this posts array, each of the items in the array is an object that contains this data. And then, and what actually splits it up and gives it to each post is our post series component. We go back up the chain to app, and we say, okay, there's also a child called header. Header can be passed a function called onPost. This is the function that we want the header to call when we actually post a tweet. And the reason why we pass that data, or pass that function to header, is because header does not have the ability to change the state of app. Does that make sense? The header component cannot change the state of app. Why is that? Data flows downward, and our rules were a React component can change its own state. I guess the point is that no other components can change the state of another component, which means that header does not get direct access to app state. So if header wants to add a post to the app, then it needs to call a function that app has provided to it in order to set a new post, for example. That's what we're doing here, is we're saying app is going to give header a function called onPost. When this function gets called, it's actually called on the app, and we can add a new item to the array if we want at that point, because it does have access to it within the app itself. Talk a little bit more about that, but before we get to there, then I have a little bit of internal state for the header. For example, what's the current content that's typed in there? We're going to use something called a controlled component. As I type characters into my field, every time I do that, it's going to update the state of the header. I'm always going to have a record of what's currently typed into my input field. I don't have to do any jQuery selection to grab that data out. We don't use jQuery in React. We very rarely use selections at all. We use the render method to declare what the DOM is going to do, and we use state to describe the data that we have. And so using this pattern here where we update the content every time someone types something in, it gives us access to that data quite easily. We also have the error. That state is important inside of the header because that's going to describe whether or not when the DOM is rendered for the status bar, whether or not it shows if your tweet is too short or tweet is too long. And then sometimes we want to show and hide certain elements on the screen, like a pop-up, or in this case, maybe we want to show and hide the compose window, like we did on Tweeter. Well, sometimes we actually, most of the time we might create a state called visible or something like that, compose visible, tweet visible, anything like that, and that could be true or false. And then when we render out that component, we use that condition to say, should we render this part of the DOM or not? If this is true, we render it, else we don't render it. And so visible state also will exist in our components. And so we've got app-wide state in our app, state that needs to go into other components, and we've also got state that never leaves the header. We've got state, so there's times when we need to decide what type of state we use. Okay? I'll come back to this when we actually start building it. Try and associate the code I'm writing with this diagram that I've created. We have data coming down. The flow of data is down, but the pattern we're going to use for Chatty is that actions will be the way that we get information back up to components. So I know we're not setting data on this component. We're calling a function that just so happens to have data passed to it. Slightly different. That header does not know how to manipulate app, but it does know how to call a function called onPost. And that's the only responsibility that we give to it. So when header calls onPost with the content, this would be your tweet, app knows what to do with it. That's the responsibility of actually creating a post. The header has the button, the app has the data. By passing this function down, we're able to have app manipulate its state itself through a function call. Okay? So data down, actions up, I guess is the way that we talk about. And this is one way to deal with it in React. Question about this? Is this context of the app passed along with the onPost function, or does React handle finding the component whose state should be modified some other way? So this is a question coming from Victoria. And we're going to be dealing with the context of this as we go through. And the context of this will be passed within the function that we create. So we're going to, in the app, when we create the onPost function, we are going to specifically bind the context to it and say that the context is the app. Okay? Don't need to worry about that right now. I'm going to get to it. But it's a good question because this context is something we will run into. And this is one of those times where I say, here we go again. We're talking about this again in a new context, in a new way. It still behaves the same. No, it's not a different this. It's the same this, but it's going to be ever more apparent to you now than it has been in the past. So I know we talked about it early on, week 1 or so, very little. Then we talked about it in week 3 a little bit with jQuery, using it for the serialize method or whatever it is that we needed for in there. Now we're talking about it again, and I'm going to show you how to bind the context of this and force it to be something as you pass that function around, that the context doesn't change on you. And thank you for the question, Quinn. That's a good one. I will get more into detail on that if I did not answer your question, which maybe I did, maybe I didn't. It is passed, but not automatically. We do it. We make that decision. Okay. that good? I hope that's good. I don't really need a response, but please let me know if that's not. Okay, so I put this here, this sort of like cool little image of a guy shaking a robot's hand, like a blue alien robot maybe. The idea is that we create these contracts in our app, and we say that we want to pay attention to certain events that occur. When someone clicks on something, we want to know about it. When someone moves their mouse, we want to know about it. Someone clicks and then drags, we want to know about it. This is how we create interactivity in our application. So the way we do that is through handling of events. These events are things like on click. So when a button is clicked, on click, we call this dot on post. So on click, you'll notice it's camel case, capital C. There's a weird little syntax going on here. This is some HTML. But what are these curly braces? How can I call this dot on post in HTML? It works in JSX. So we're going to be using something called JSX, which is a hybrid of JavaScript and HTML that has come with React. And all of our JSX files are converted into JavaScript files for us through a pipeline, through Webpack. So we write our JavaScript with some embedded HTML. And when we do that, we need to tell the parts of the HTML which parts execute JavaScript, kind of like EJS files, where we have to say like less than percentage and then do some JavaScript in there. We have to do something similar with JSX files. And what we do is we indicate that this is the beginning of a piece of JavaScript by using the curly braces, by wrapping this any of the JavaScript in curly braces. So here we're actually passing a reference to a function, to the onClick event. And so when this button is clicked, it will call the onPost method that we pass to it. Questions about that? Questions about that? Do this? Do this? Do this? How we feel? It's a lot to take in. But it's just the beginning. This is just an introduction. I like to give an introduction. But I like to give an introduction because if I just go start to write this stuff down, then I didn't even give you a chance to ask questions about it. I know there's notes, there's this, and there's live coding, and then there's more questions after. By the end of the week, we'll know a little bit about React. Yes, thank you. Okay, so one question here first, right? Okay. So the question for Victoria is, were we expected to create the hierarchy yesterday? And I don't think so. I think, Chatty, you continue working on it today, and you create that hierarchy today. Because you, well, oh, sorry, did you have to diagram it? Is that the question? Did you have to diagram it? Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to show you an example using with this Tweeter app. You'd follow a similar pattern with Chatty. By the end of the week, you'll have done what I'm doing in this app. No, I don't think so. I think it's still early. Maybe. Okay, so the question for Victoria is, are these brackets kind of like the $sign for jQuery? And they're not in the sense that they're more like, it's more like templating language. More like a template language. So it's a lot more like EJS, where you tell it when you want it to be executed as JavaScript with the less than percentage symbol, and you close and open the JavaScript portions with that type of a tag. This here is the same type of thing. We say we want to start using cursor up so that we see it here. We start using JavaScript at this point. This is all kind of like HTML syntax here. All the way up to here, or I guess to here. And then this says we want to start executing JavaScript inside. So this actually ends up being JavaScript, and you could do anything you want in here. In the case of an onClick, it has to be, usually have to pass it a function. But you could do any expression you want in JavaScript there, and then you tell it at this point that we're done with JavaScript. Now we go back to HTML. So all of this is the template for JavaScript JSX. Oh yeah. So if in that case, what I would do is I would actually pass an anonymous function, and here I would say param that. So it would call my anonymous function, and by calling my anonymous function, then it triggers this call passing a parameter, because otherwise it would be like this function here will actually get an event passed to it, like we do jQuery events. Get that event here. Target event dot. So this function here will be passed an event that we get more about which event was actually true. Question? All right. Go. All right, I got about 20 minutes before break, and what I want to do is probably get us to the point where around where we are with Chatty, in terms of taking our HTML, breaking it up into different components. Take a break. And I guess maybe what I should do is also show you this app running. So I'm going to switch over to a different branch, check out. Start. So here it is with tweets. Good morning. Post it. My name is Chelsea Ingmar. Randomly generated for me when I log in. The application. I can show and hide this pose button, and I can obviously post. If I try and post and there's nothing in there, you cannot post an empty message. If I try and do this one, is going to be longer. Post it. You cannot post more than 140 characters. So it tells me, gives me all that stuff that Tweeter had in it. So I want to show you how to build this with React. The reason I do this is because if you've built it in jQuery already, you get to see some of the differences between jQuery, how we would handle some of the things, React instead. That's my goal. So I'm going to switch back to the live branch, which has most of the app there, but it has the back end, but no UI yet. If I load this up, fair enough, it is just a body. This is my application right here. And all of the DOM that I generate through the render methods will be put into this here, into these two divs, and everything inside of here is controlled by React. So people who have done a little bit of reading or a little bit of introduction will notice that I have a index file here, index.html. And index.html has this div with the ID of app. I mean, I can call this anything I want, but I need to give it some unique identifier that when we load up our application, it can find that app tag, the one that I have in my HTML, and it can start rendering DOM, including this app component, that location. Okay, so by doing this call here, we take an app component and we push it into the DOM at this point here, which really is just this item. So app is going to be rendered into this div. App is here. App has its own kind of, when we render it out, it renders out simple div. Okay? And if I start to put stuff in here, like hello there, I save that, we're going to notice that you can't see it because the font color is the same, but it's up there. It says hello there. And so now in my div here that React is rendering, it says hello. So as I make changes to this, we get to see them. save that back. And I've also created a list of the things that we want to do today. There are 18 steps that I've written out here. And the first one is copy HTML layout into app.jsx. So here what I want to do is I want to take this HTML that I designed, this in my design folder. This is just the HTML here that I created, the static HTML with the styles applied to it already. I've built the structure, I've applied the styles, I've refactored it a few times, I've made it the way that I want it to be. And so now I'm happy to take this here, this header, and this main, and all the stuff inside of the body. I'm going to take this, and I can just paste this now right into here. So this is like the first step. I have my HTML built already. I take it and I copy and paste it into my. I save it. I come over here, and we're seeing some stuff. It doesn't look the way that I expect it to. I mean, all the fonts. It has all the data that was in that HTML, but no style is being applied to it. So we should notice we should always have this open. Yeah. 100%. Yeah, so the first thing we talked about today, and I know a little bit late, so we'll go over it quickly again. No problem. I want to make sure that you see this. So we got a wireframe, and I started with a wireframe. I built a wireframe and structure, and then I went into a tool that allows me just to do visual design. Sketch, Photoshop, GIMP is a free one that you could use. So the new image manipulation E-stand program, yeah. It's free. And it's multi-platform, right? So be able to install it if you want. I create my visual style, and it doesn't have any interactivity yet, but it represents the fonts and the colors and sizes and all that stuff. And then I take that and I build pure HTML out of it. I don't have any external file. Well, maybe I have an external CSS file if that's what I do. But I have the HTML that describes this, and that's sort of where I came to with this. Is in my design directory, I've got a PNG file that represents my layout, and from this, I go and I build HTML. Oops, HTML down here, and this HTML is the hard-coded, but structural version of this. And what I've done is I've copied this, and I've pasted it into my app.jsx just as HTML. So that's what I do. I don't build the components from scratch without any HTML, because if I find I do that, I typically get it wrong, and I have to do a lot more work than if I just build it in HTML, get the structure right, get all the style right. We know how finicky style can be. Well, I get it right there first, and right there it's a little cheaper, and especially when you're learning React, it makes it a lot harder to think in terms of components. Someone more experienced might not do this. They can usually get away with it. As you're getting more experience with this, build your HTML first, and then copy and paste it, just like I've done. So I copy and pasted it, and I look at my console, and when I reload this, I get this error, unknown DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So what this means, and you're going to get these warnings every now and then with React, and I want to go through. I'm actually going to make sure that these warnings show up. I'm not going to avoid them. I'm going to make them happen, and I'm going to show you them, and I'm going to show you how to fix them. So in this case here, it's saying that it doesn't know about this property that we've given one of the DOM elements, and the property name that it doesn't know about is class. So can we imagine why that might be? I'm in this JavaScript file right now. It looks like HTML, but it's not. It's JavaScript. So why would we not be able to use the word class here? Yeah, because JavaScript has the word class already as a reserved word. If you notice up here, the way that I define this component in the first place is with a class keyword. So classes in JavaScript and classes in CSS are different. Classes in HTML are different. The HTML classes refer to a CSS class. So what we need to do here is when we copy and paste this HTML into the app, we need to go through and change all this class to the word class name instead. That's what React will understand. So it needs us to do that. We don't do it manually. We just copy all of this here. I do a find and replace. Copy this and I find and replace. Most editors should have this. Here's a replace. I want to find the word class. Do it. Header. All this stuff. Here I'm expanding the search to the selection. It selected all of these classes that it found, and I want to replace it with class name. So I should be able to replace all, and now all of them have been replaced. So I save this, and I come over here, and now my app is no longer complaining about that issue, because I've given these the property, the class name property that React actually understands. So that's something that's very common to deal with. And when you're moving from HTML into React, you change from class to class name. So we look at these steps that I need to take. One of them is copy HTML layout into app.jsx. I've done that. Number 2, convert class and other reserved names to the React version. So I only had class, but there are other things that React reserves, or the way they define these properties. Sometimes they go from all lowercase. Term content editable is a property we can put on divs, for example. We want a div that we can actually change the content of. Put the content editable tag on it. Well, in React, it needs content editable with a capital E. That's all. But it warns you about this. And normally, it's smart enough to say, did you mean, and then give you a pretty good hint as to what you really call it. Okay. Number 3, and this is what we'll do before we go to break. We'll break the HTML into separate components to create the hierarchy that we talked about. And I think, Kevin, this is where you are now, Patty, right? You've taken the HTML, you put it all in your app.jsx? Yeah, so that's where we are now. Now what we would do is, if we've taken this is our app, technically it renders all this. We could actually build this all in one app.jsx if we wanted to. But that doesn't really help us so much, because then we're managing all the state here. This component would grow to hundreds, if not thousands, of lines on a bigger application. But instead, we want to break it up into different pieces. So what we do is we identify what those pieces are. And I kind of like to, I look at this and I say, okay, well, I've got these components here. I'm going to break it up first into a header, a series, and post, for example. So I'll take this header, and I will create a new folder in my JS directory here called components. And inside components, I'm going to create a file called header.jsx. I capitalize it. All components should be capitalized. Convention. And I paste it in here. Well, what I need to do is start writing the actual, this is just the HTML, so I'm going to have that ready for me. I'm going to start by import React from the React library itself. Class header, that's going to be my new component. Called header, export default header. You'll notice that we're using this import export stuff. Who's seen that so far? It's ES6. It's like require and module.exports, but it's the official standardized ES6 version of that feature. Whereas require and module.exports, that comes from before this was around. This was the initial solution to that problem. Now we're going to use ES6 imports because we get to convert these in. Yeah. ES6 class, really? I don't know. Might have to ask him about it, because I haven't heard anything about that yet. Yeah, so I mean, we're introducing a little bit of ES6 as we go along here. We did our intro in week 2, and now as we go, you're gonna be finding a lot more ES6 available to you in React. Probably show you some destructuring, which is really nice, and other kind of features like that. ES6 is so big, but I think by the end of the program, we'll have introduced most of the useful parts of ES6. So here I'm using ES6 imports. And what I want to do, I'm also using ES6 classes. So I'm defining a class component. I can actually define a component called header by doing this if I want. I could do either a class or a function. Those are 2 ways for me to define components. For now, I'm going to stick with the class definition, and I will try and use a function definition somewhere. The reason I decide to use one or the other is, does my component have state or not? If it doesn't have state, I'll usually use a function instead of a class. If it has state, I'll usually use a class. If I'm using a class, I need to extend a component that comes from React. So in addition to importing the React library itself, I need to import just from the React library a component class. It comes from React. And here what I'm doing is I'm saying that my header component extends the React component class, meaning that it inherits all the behavior of the component, a React component. All the behavior of a React component, you ask? Things like lifecycle methods. If I want to, or I guess this also sets up this .state for me and this .props for me by extending this class. So every time you're creating a class-based component, you need to extend the React component to get some of that component functionality in there. Okay? This header needs a render method, because this is what we're going to do, is we're going to render this HTML. Every time this render method is called, we return it. We return the DOM elements that we want rendered. So I've just taken this. I've created my render method. Render method is the only thing that's actually necessary in a class. All we actually have to have is a render method. In this case, the component isn't very useful because all it does is render out static DOM. We'll change that. So this is kind of the structure of a very basic component. Hit save. I come over here, and we'll notice that my header is gone. But that's because I just ripped it out of the HTML, and I've not actually included it back in here. You see that we only have the main class container, but there's no header associated with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I want to use the header here. So we get to use these components as if they are HTML as well. Header is the one I just created. And in order to use it, I need to import header from components header.jsx. Now I get it back. Because I've imported this code and I've called it header, in JSX I get to use it as if it is a DOM element. And I would do the same thing. I would create my other components and I would start to fill in those as components instead of the HTML that represents the components. I'm able to hide a lot of HTML behind a single component. And then when someone wants to use this header, all they need to know is that it's called header, and all the HTML that's inside of it is kind of hidden from them. They don't need to worry so much about that. It's a really nice level of abstraction. It's a nice way to think of it. So I'm going to take this main thing here, and I'm going to further break this down, and I would call this main. So I got header and main sections. Well, then in that case, I need to import main from components main.jsx as well. This is going to break things. It says component not found. Can't find this thing. That's okay. I will create it. I didn't create it first, but I can go either order I want. Main.jsx, and in here it's going to be the same. Import React component from React library class main extends. That's just me creating this new export default main. Create our render method. It returns DOM. There it is. Pasted it in here. I save this. Got it looking like it did before. But now, in here, it still has header and main. If we go over and look at these React tools, which I expect everyone to have installed already, now this tool is actually allowing us to see a little bit more information about the app. For example, that we've got this header component. Inside of the header component, these are the HTML elements. Inside of main, these are the HTML elements. And I also get information about the app, for example, as props. Well, this one it's an empty object, doesn't contain anything yet. But as we add it, we get to see all the props and state that exist in our components using this debug tool. We'll break this down a little bit farther. We're going to create a component for postSeries.jsx and post.jsx. I'm just going to copy, paste this, call this post instead, call this post, and then now what I want to do is I want to take a single post HTML. What I'm going to take this HTML that's in here, and I'm going to rip out the parts that don't represent a post, which means pretty much everything except for a single article. So remember in Twitter, an article, that was a tweet. Same here. An article is a tweet or a post, right? So now this post component returns a single post for us. And the post series, which I'll also just kind of copy and paste from main. I don't need this main container, but I do need this section, and inside of there, I don't need the articles anymore because those will be handled by post. And here I need to import post from post.jsx. You'll notice that I didn't do .components here. That's because post series is in the same. Oh, I'm just creating in the wrong section. Sorry about that. Let me. Client JS. I want. Oh, I didn't. I did it well. What? Oh. So components has header, main, post, and post series. App is in a parent folder. That means that app needs to import header and main from the components directory. But when I'm inside of post series here, I can import post directly from the same directory that I'm in right now. So the pathing for imports is relative to where you are. In this case, if I'm in the component directory already, I'm just importing the other. So the only other thing I need to do now is in my main here, instead of having this whole section with all this data and all these posts, I'm going to have it render the post series here. And I'm going to import post series from the post series component. Oh, okay. Doesn't look different, except, oh, there's only one post now. So I got rid of the hard-coded, or I got rid of most of the hard-coded HTML. And so now what we end up with, if we were to look at this app structure, is we have header, and we have main. And main has, oh, let me guess. Yeah, from here, right? Oh, wrong one. That's main. Post series. This has to be post series. This has to be post series. And then main has to be main. And post has to be post and post. Header has to be header and header. And I think I'm in good shape now. Now, main has post series, and post series has a single post. And I get to go in here if I want, say, well, here's some more posts. They're all the same post, but there's more of them now. And so that's kind of how the structure of our DOM is, the result of us creating this hierarchy that I promised I'd get back to. I've created that component hierarchy as I designed it. We haven't added any state or props yet. We're not doing any of that, but we'll do that when we get back. Unless there are any questions, let's take a break. Let me just double check with Victoria to make sure that there are no questions. Victoria, do you have any questions before we take a quick break? I put them to sleep, perhaps? Okay, feel free to go for a break. I haven't heard from them yet. We'll see you in like 5-10 minutes. 5 would be nice. 6 or 7 would be great. 10 might be a little too long. Okay.
I'll try to refactor my code to make it
Mhm.
It,
Okay.
I actually got the first. Okay, let's. At first, what I was doing.
Okay.
Like, like not right what you're doing. So I'm like, okay, instead of doing that, let's put the footer here
Okay. Yeah.
and insert it. Made. Get element by
Oh, I
ID
see.
made. I just called body.
Was
made.
that's what you were doing before?
No, only
Okay.
now when I saw you doing it now, I'm like, okay, this looks about right.
But so what you want though is you want to import the footer component and you want app to render that for you. So you're only going to do this once here. This stuff?
Yeah.
We're going to say don't do that. We're going to render we're only going to mount the app into us. I mean, you technically can do it, but we're going to make React manage everything that's a child of app rather than have it be done in this loading code here. So we save that. And now app needs to import a chat bar and a, what else do you have? Header or something like that? Okay, so we need to create elements like this. Then here you'd want to put chat bar.
Oh, so you put. Oh, you always just like chat bar. Like chat bar.
Just like I'm doing here. So in here, I've got header and main. You would put chat bar with a / to close it. Yeah.
Oh, and that's why it's calling it. Oh.
Now you should have seen something
That's
here.
the thing. I was actually talking to ask about. Target data is not a thing. When I go here, I'm telling the system. So chat bar. I was doing like get out of my ID.
Yeah.
Where did so we were deleting that from here?
No, well you keep that because you still need to mount this to. Oh, I see. This needs to.
I should have mounted to body.id.
This needs to be React root.
I deleted.
Yeah.
I get it now. Okay.
And actually,
So
this nav bar here, this should go into. Oh no, it's not body. Is not React root. Sorry. That this would be a div here.
that was their original.
Div have ID of React root. Okay, and it's just gonna be empty. And it's going to, everything that we create with React is going to go into this element. Now it's the React root. Chat bar is not defined. That's fair. We didn't define it, right? We've tried to use it. Tried to use the chat bar inside app.jsx right here, but we never imported it. Got to import it just like I did here with the header. No, you don't need component. Component is not a part of chat bar. Component is part of React.
Yeah, I see. Actual file is all the same.
Should be /chat bar. Capital. Yeah. You might not have to, but yeah, you should. Let's get rid of the comma there. Get rid of the comma there. Yeah. You only need it if you're actually going to import multiple pages.
Module build.
Your import is incorrectly spelled. Okay, so it's saying app.render, a valid must be returned, you may have returned undefined. So let's take a look at the app. So app render, we're not actually returning this. So here, you see, I have to do, in my render method, I actually return this.
Just like these guys here, like.
Yeah. No, that has to be inside your render. It's a return of the render method. Let's go back. You didn't.
Yeah,
That needs to be a. Oh no.
Successfully. Sweet.
There you
Okay,
go.
I get it. So I'll just do the rest without.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you
No
much.
problem. So classes are all that class has done is give us syntax sugar that wraps up function objects. So when you learn about prototypes, when you learn about JavaScript objects, you can take JavaScript objects and put functions on them, right? Put values on them. Classes do that for us as well. Different way to declare the same thing. Because I could do something like function app, and then app dot prototype dot render turn. I can still do this. This is how I would do it if I didn't have class syntax. I would still create a function called app, then I would attach methods to it. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so when we left off, I had broken up that chunk of HTML into separate components, and then I referenced those components inside of my inside of other components using these imports here. I've imported header and main into my app JSX, then I use it here, and then inside of main I import post series and I use it. Inside post series I import post and use it a number of times. So that's kind of how this structure works. it's still just giving us a static representation of our site, though. There's no dynamic nature. We're not giving it state. We're not giving it props. It's not, DOM is never changed. It renders the initial time, and then after that, nothing happens. So we want to start to affect the way that this renders, and we want to do that by adding some state to our application. The first piece of state that I want to add is actually, I want to add state to app.jsx to manage the current posts. So we know that our app has state that represents the posts that should currently be visible. I want to give my app that initial state. I'll do that here in the constructor. And if I'm calling the constructor of my component, I need to also call the constructor of the component that I extend. Okay? So I know this is object-oriented programming. We don't talk about it a lot yet. We don't talk about it a lot at all. But the idea here is that constructor is the method that gets called when we create this class. Create this object out of the class here. Constructor will be called. And as a result, we need the components constructor to also be called. So we call super, and super calls our parent's constructor, whatever method we're in for the parent as well. Because we're calling it inside the constructor, calling the components constructor, the constructor is called pass props, so we pass those along as well. Again, it's unfortunate I can't get too deep into this. Just trust me that if you're creating the constructor, you need to call super as well. If you do not, then we get a warning. Missing super call in constructor. That's useful. All right, thanks. All done, right? So, although we're a little worried, we don't know what that means. We don't know why that has to happen. Okay, we're building up our understanding. So good news, the warnings are going to help you out with that if you forget it. And hopefully by the end of week 8, when we've had some more time with object-oriented programming and in Ruby and stuff, the constructor, inheritance, all that stuff makes a little bit more sense by then. That's my goal. Our goal. But for now, we just have to accept some of these things. So for example, in the constructor, if that's the first thing that gets called, I want to set the initial state. The initial state for my app is that there are no posts. The posts are going to come from a database at some point. So in this case, I'll say this.state is equal to, I'll give it a posts array that's empty. So right now, this app has state. Its state is an empty array called posts. If I load this up, and I go into the React debugging tool here, and I click on app, we get to see over here that the state of app now contains posts that's an array of 0 value. Cool? Okay. So if I have this state, what I want to do is I want to tell other components about it. In here, we have app has the state posts, and we want to pass main. We want to pass that data to main, and so that main can pass that data to post series. We do that through props, and props are described on the actual declaration of the component we're using. In this case, we want to create a prop called posts. Main has a prop called posts, and it equals this.state.posts. So I've just taken the state here from app, this.state.posts, and I've passed it onto the main component using the property posts. And what that means is that my main component now has a variable inside of it, this.props.posts. And that just is the exact same array that we've just passed down. So we know that the main component doesn't use that. The post series component will use that list. Again, we come back here and we say, main has it but doesn't care. All it cares about is taking that data and passing it down to the next child. You say, well, why do we have main? That seems kind of useless. Why don't we just post series directly? I wanted to show you that sometimes components do nothing more than pass data down to their children. Here's an example of that. So instead of using that value here, I'm going to actually continue down the line and give post series a property called post as well. The value that gets passed to post series is this .props.posts. So app passed this dot state dot posts as a property called posts. Main receives that property, and then it further passes it down to post series as a post property. Post series has this dot state dot or this dot props dot post now, and we can use that inside of the render. And what we want to do is we want to go through this array of posts, and for each post in the array, we want to render a post component. Okay. We do that by saying we're going to convert our array of objects to an array of React components. These are two different types of data that we have. We have objects, and we want them to be React components, so they get rendered in the DOM. Can anyone think of a way to convert an array from one type of item into another? Map. Yeah, we can map over it. We can map over each item in our posts array. For each object, we can convert it to a React element. That's what I'm going to do right now. This is a common pattern in React that we want. We want to learn how to take something. We're going to call it the posts here. We're just going to give it a variable, posts. This is going to be local to our post series render function. And what this is going to equal to is this dot props dot posts dot map. So I'm taking that props array, or that posts array, and I'm going to map over it. What that means is that for each item in the array, I want to return a post. This is me converting an array of objects into an array of React elements. Because in JSX, this thing will get converted to a React element for me. JSX helps us with that. This gets converted into JavaScript code. And in JavaScript code, this is called like react.createElement. That's what this gets converted to, react.createElement. You could write React without JSX if you want. You just have to use the JavaScript API, which is react.createElement, react.cloneElement, react. There's a bunch of stuff we can do with React. But we use JSX because it helps us with this. It's a lot nicer way to declare these things. So here, you could think that this is react.createElement. That's what it would be doing. But instead, we're going to use the JSX syntax to make it easier on ourselves. So here what it does is it takes this posts array and it loops over each of the items in the posts array, and we get out of it a post item. We can render an array of React elements just as easily as we can render a single React element. We can do it like this. This is an array of React elements. So when we put that into the DOM like so, it renders out as multiple React elements. If I save this, we're going to see that app has state of posts, right? And it passes those posts to main, and main has props called posts. And main takes those and they pass them down to post series. So post series has a prop called posts. And post series then tries to render posts, but the none exist. And if none exists, then it doesn't render anything for you. So what we'd expect here is no post showing up. Okay? Well, what happens if I were to add an element to that post array? If I add an element to that post array, if my array of posts is no longer empty, what happens? I'll render one post. Yeah, so what I can do is I can go up to app here, and I can't edit this here directly, but I can go into my app JSX and I could say, yeah, 1 post, 2 posts, 3 posts, 4 posts. I don't care what data is in there right now because I'm not using the data yet. But I do care about the number of items in there because I know that for every item in my array, it's going to render a post. So I've got 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's gone through and it's converted my array of posts into a number of different React elements that get rendered in by post series for me. I've noticed I've got this error here, this little red X. So I go to the console and I check it out and it says, warning, each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. Okay, so that might seem weird to you, but it's normal in React to get this. Every time I do this pattern here, where I create an array of elements, of React elements, I need to give each element a unique key property so that the virtual DOM, who's heard of virtual DOM? Okay, so virtual DOM, it's a virtual representation of the DOM. It's a lot faster to use because it doesn't actually have to re-render for us to have it, for us to actually know what it's going to be like. The virtual DOM needs to know about every single individual element to figure out whether or not it's going to re-render certain things or not. And so what it's saying is it needs a key property to do that. What we would need to do here is we need to say key is equal to, and then some unique value here. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just take the posts. We know right now that the value is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I want to give those unique values to my post as a key here. So when I reload this, we no longer get that error. And when we look at the React output again, we're noticing that now each post has a unique key. So the virtual DOM, the system that resolves this, can understand that these are all different elements, even though they looked exactly the same to it. They don't look the same anymore. We've added unique keys to each one. I wouldn't use an object there. I would knowingly avoid that. What I would do is I'd give it the ID of my post. If my posts come out of a database and each post has a unique ID, then I would use that unique ID to represent each post in my DOM. So I wouldn't put an object in there. I'd put a string or a number, and I'd make sure it's a unique value. Is that all right? Yeah, so that was the question for Victoria. If I were to put an object in here instead of a number, would it jam an object in there? I mean, we can check it out pretty quickly. We can go into app.jsx, and we make each of these objects. And now it's saying console encountered 2 children with the same key, object, object. Child keys must be unique. 2 children share a key, only the first child will be. So that's bad news. We're not rendering two of the 5 things. We need to be careful with that. We need to make sure we give these. We need to make sure that we give the key a unique value. Bring this back, get 5 back, everything's good again. And I'm going to switch that over very shortly once I start getting data into this. But for now, I'm just kind of mocking it out, right? I'm trying to figure out what's this actually going to work like. So I've got add state to app.jsx to manage current posts. Pass the post to the child components as a prop. We've done that, right? Anyone disagree with me that we've done that? Anyone not know how that would work? Pass the post to the child components as props. We did that. In the post series component, map over the posts array. We did that as well, right? We went through, we took this array of posts and we converted it into an array of React elements. And then we render those React elements by placing that array in the render method here, by using that array. I also want to, in the post component, use the prop to replace the static. Okay, so that's new. Now I need to figure out how to get this data, get real data, so that I can pass real data to these posts. So these posts will render with their individual pieces of data. First what I need to do is get the data. I go to my server, messages, route, and I've created this ahead of time, similar to what you had with Tweeter. Big in this. So I've got my network request. When I do that, it's not very easy to read right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. This is just data that represent posts. And it's actually the data that I showed initially. When I showed the app working, it was using this data. And I'm not going to use the API directly right now. What I'm going to do is show you a nice little, well, similar to what you did in Tweeter, where I'm going to create a data.json file. And I'm going to paste this in here. And then I'm going to use my prettified JSON to fix it up a little bit. So we'll notice that each of these items here, it's an array of objects. They're sorted already in reverse chronological. So I want the newest one first. You'll notice that's the one that I posted this morning. It says good morning, right? All the other ones are random sentences. Okay. So its ID is number 11. That's unique. That's what I'm going to use as the key. Each one has an item associated with it called user that also has a name, avatar, that type of information. So I'm going to take this data and I want to import it into my app. A JSON file, we can do that. We can say that the posts is something I import from data.json. So I've just taken this data.json file and I've imported it and I've assigned the value to posts. So now posts is the array of objects. And so then when I initialize this app, instead of hard coding it like so, I'm going to just say that my post is equal to the posts that I just imported. Okay? So I've imported this data. I could have just copied, I could have just taken this, and instead I could have done like const posts equal to this if I wanted to, similar to what you did with Twitter. But I'm going to use the imports and not fill this file. So that's kind of how I'd rather do it. Import posts from the JSON file. JSON file contains an array of objects. So now I have access to that array of objects right here. Load this. Go back to my file. Oh, encountered 2 children with the same key. That makes sense, right? Ran into that exact same problem that I created for myself before. Whereas in post series, we created the key as post. Well, post is an object now. So here this should be post.id. That's the key now, post.id. I reload this, and sure enough, we have all these posts. It's still hard-coded, right? Like this post component is not using any of this data yet. But now we notice that instead of 5 elements, there's 10 or 11 of them, 1 for each item in my JSON. So that's working. And then when I look at React here, and I go into this app file, make everything bigger. Make this bigger. So here, now the key corresponds directly to the ID that came from the database, which we can guarantee to be. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now all we need to do is give the other data to this post so we can start to replace things like the name and the date, the avatar. So I'm going to go in here and start working on this. Post here, I can actually show you. I'm just going to show you that inside of my component, I've got this post series. I'm going to set a breakpoint here. And reload this. So now I've hit this breakpoint, and so my very first post looks like this. Good morning, right? So this is all the data that's being passed. So post is an object that has an ID, likes, date, content, and user. Okay, that's good. And if I continue to the next one, and I look at post, then I can see that post is the next piece of data. So we are iterating through this object. For each item, we're creating a new post component that we want to have the data in it. So for that, I'm going to start to add items to this. I want to pass in the user. That's fine, post.user. I want to add in the content is equal to post.content. What about the date? Equal to post.date. So I'm passing these properties into each post component, and each of them are going to have different data but the same properties. So now post should have access to things like user, content, and date. We just pass that in there. So if I go into post, I can start to replace this stuff, like for example, here, the source for the image, that is this.props.user.avatar. And the name is this.props.user.full, I believe. the date, this.props.date. I'm not going to do like buttons right now. I'm going to forget about that. And I'm going to think about the this.props.content. Now, when I reload this, no errors. That's good news. And here they are, the components that I got from my data, or the actual data. This is the data that I loaded from my JSON file. Now rendering each post out with that data. Is anyone confused how I got the data from that JSON file into each of these components? If we look at the React output here, we can see that main has a post series, and post series passing all this data as properties components. Hint, this is very similar to how your messages will work in Chatty. You're going to have a list of messages. You're going to have an array of objects, each object representing a message. When you post a new message, you add on to that array of messages, and that will cause a re-render. Then your message list component will map over that array and give you back a message for each one. And that message will have the data inside of it. And very similar to what we've just done here. I'd like to show you a bit more ES6 because it's very useful for things like this. You'll notice that I've had to repeat this .props everywhere inside of here. I kind of like to use destructuring. So if I say const user date content equal to this .props, well, I've just avoided having to duplicate this .props everywhere because I've created local variables for each of these, and I've pulled them out of the props object using destructuring. So user.full, that'll work, date, content, these are all local to me. So I can use this destructuring syntax here. I can say I want a local variable called user, a local variable called date, and a local variable called content. And I want those things to pass or point to the variables that with those same keys inside of this .props. Okay? So here's a little ES6, destructuring assignment. Fine. Yes. For here, it's not destructuring, but we actually, if the key that we want to assign and the variable that holds the value have the same name, we do get shorthand like that. So if I have a variable called posts, which I do, it's right here. I have a variable called posts, and I want to create a key called posts, and I want to have the value that that variable points to. I get to say post is equal to posts like this, instead of having to do the whole thing. I just didn't do that initially because I didn't want to distract, but it's a good question. I'm going to start doing this from now on, where if my variable is named the same thing that I want my key to be named, I'll just use it. And this can be mixed in, where if you say, well, don't know this one, whatever. This is equal to some other value. I can mix these up. I don't have to all of a sudden have to start. I don't have to start doing this just because I've done it down here. I can mix these things together. Still working. Chelsea Ingemar is back. All right. Any questions? So, going to keep a looking at my list here, see what's next. Okay, so in the post component, use the prop to replace the static content. Does anyone disagree with the fact that we've done that? Not know how that would be, right? The post component now has each of the post objects defined. Each of the post components has the data from each of the objects that we passed in our post array. In the header, set up the content state. So now we're going to make our way over to this other component called header, and we're going to start to track the state of what we've typed into there. Because right now, sure, I can type in here, that's fine, and it technically is keeping track of that. But for me to grab this value out of here, I would have to do some jQuery style selection, and we don't do that in React. It's anti-pattern in React. We want React to manage the DOM for us, and we don't do anything to get in its way with that. So what we want to do, I mean, I shouldn't say that you never do it. I have to do it very rarely, and I do my best to avoid it. But there are some situations where I have to grab a DOM element and get something from it. Maybe it's where it's currently scrolled to or something like that. In that case, I will use something like find DOM node or use references in React. So there's React-specific solutions to this. But I would never do import jQuery or do document.getElement by ID in my React, because React's meant to do all that for me. And for Chatty, you're not going to have to worry about it. So I want in here, I want to track some state. So I'm going to say constructor this dot state equal to content, and it's empty. It starts off empty. So now I need to start thinking about the event that triggers a state change, and I need to kind of, I guess, yeah, it's really just the event that triggers a state change. So when I start typing stuff in here, I need to handle the onChange for this input field. We're going to use something called controlled components, and the documentation for that is under the forms section under Quick Start. So there's this thing called controlled components, and a controlled component is something where you manage the state of the component using React. Okay? With React, or I guess with HTML, we'll notice that some of our HTML elements actually have their own state. If I type in here, the state of this component is the characters that I've typed into it, that it's focused, right? Things like that. So I might need to track that state myself. I want to track the state of what's currently typed in there, and then to do that I use a controlled component. A controlled component has two specific attributes on it. One, we set the value from the state itself. So every render, we grab the current value and we put it into the field. We also have to listen to the onChange, and every time we change the value, we need to update the state. So I'm going to go to the text area here. Just the text area HTML element, the HTML element that represents the text area. And I'm going to say that this has a value. Right? That should not be new to anyone, giving a value to an input field. But here we say that the value is this dot state dot content. So this field now, I'm trying to type, but its value hard-coded to be nothing, empty. Okay. Well, what that means is I need to also add, for this to be a controlled component, I need to say when it changes, onChange, we'll call this dot onContent. This is just going to be a function that I create inside of my class called onContent that gets called every time we type in a new character. OnContent. Here I'm just declaring that function inside of my class. And here what I want to do is say this dot on, or when the content changes, I get an event. An event triggers this function called. Therefore, an event variable will be passed in to us so we can get more information about the event. Things like which key was pressed. Things like what characters are currently inside of that input field. What I want to do is I want to set the state of my component and the content of my component to be event.target.value. I want to take the value of what I've currently typed into this input field, and I want to change the state of the component to match that. Now I should be able to type in here, and we're getting an error every single time. The error say, not read property set state of undefined. Not read property set state of undefined. Okay, well, where do I call set state? Because I just changed some code and I call set state. So why is it telling me that I cannot call set state on undefined? this must be undefined. So it does not understand the value of this, or this does not point to the header component, because that's really where I want to call this .setState, is on the header component instance itself. So here I need to deal with the context of this. This is the first time we're going to run into it. So there's more than one way to fix this problem. You're going to see a couple different patterns. I'm going to show you the one that is, I think, what we'd use in Chatty. There's two that I use, mostly. The one that I use normally requires us to not use standardized JavaScript. So it has to convert it into something that the browser will understand. So I'm going to avoid teaching that right now. But I think over the next couple of days, you'll have an opportunity to do it. We'll do like the simplest and I'd say most straightforward, but can be annoying to some people. Okay? So this .onContent is a function. Does anyone disagree with that? Just a function. Okay. So on a function, we can call bind. And what bind will do is return to us a new function built off of the onContent function, where the context of this is set by us. We get to decide that when we bind this function, we want the context of this to be something very specific, and we want that to be true wherever the function is called from. Because right now, the thing that's calling this is like some event handler somewhere. That's why it can't handle the context of this very well. So what we do is we bind in the constructor. We say this .onContent, that's the onContent function that belongs to this class. It is going to equal this .onContent.bind this. So I've now taken the value of this inside of the constructor, which is header. So in the constructor, this is always going to be the class that the constructor exists in, the instance of it. Thank you. So now I've replaced this .onContent with a new version of onContent that has the context of this set to be the header the header component itself. So now it would be like header.setState, which we think to be is more accurate. That's what we want it to be. So we're going to set the state of the header component, where the state of the content is event.target.value. So whatever I've typed into this form so far. So now as I type in here, it's not being removed, right? We're actually able to fill it in. And if we look at the React component itself, we look at the header here, we can see over here, empty. It starts empty. And as I type in here, it's not empty anymore. It's filling my content in with the data that I'm typing into this field using the onChange method. And when I do that, every time I do that, it re-renders my header. And it re-renders it with whatever is in the value of this .state.content, which means it's whatever I've typed in so far. So now I could say inside of my header, this .state.content, that's what the user typed in. Don't have to do any jQuery selection for this. I don't have to select any of these elements. I've got that data available to me. Okay? So that is a controlled component in React. That's typically how we deal with form elements. Here we've set it up, and now what we want to do. Oh, I guess I jumped ahead a little bit because I did it. I did number 11, set up an event handler to trigger an update on the content on input. That's okay. I mean, either way, we get to do this. What I want to do now, though, is pass a current and maximum character count to a status bar as props. I want to start to think about updating this bar based on if there are too many characters or not, or maybe just for now, how many characters have currently been typed in. As I type characters in, I want to update this status bar and show me the number of characters that I have remaining. That might be useful. So I do that inside of the header. I want to pass that data to a status bar. So I'm actually going to create a new component now. And this kind of shows you that sometimes you're going to find that you want to maybe hide some data or create sort of something reusable or something. In this case, I'm going to create a status bar.jsx file. And inside here, I'm going to create it like I do any other component. Okay? But let's say that this one here is going to be a functional component because it has no state. The actual status bar has no state. The header has state. the status bar has no state. So what I want to do here is export default function status bar, and I'm going to use status bar that takes in props. This is a function-based component. It takes in props and it renders out. Whatever this function returns is the render method. That's its render method right there. Don't have to put render in here because it's not a class, but whatever this function returns, that's what we expect it to render. So here we're going to say that we want this to render out this piece of status data here. So it's going to return these JSX elements. And it's going to need to render the status bar as a new React component. Import status bar from status bar.jsx file that we created. Okay. So it should look the same in the sense that I'm just wrapping it up. So here, what's it explaining about something? Reference React is not defined, of course. I still need to my status bar. You'll notice here, I've not used the word React anywhere, but it's complaining about not having import React from. Can anyone guess why that would be? Because it's a JSX file, exactly, great. And JSX files get converted into React.createElement all over the place. So it needs React in there. Whenever you're using JSX, even if we're not using the word React, it requires us to import React because when it does its conversion, it does need access to the React object. So that should fix that problem. We load this up, and sure enough, we take a look at our header, and our header has down here a status bar component that we just created. And inside the status bar is the counter and the error message. So now I want to take I want to pass some props to this. I want to give it things like the count is equal to this.state.content.length. That's the number of characters that have currently been typed in. Pass that. Maybe we also pass in a max equal to 140. Okay, so now we pass those properties to the status bar, and the status bar can reference this.props.count and this.props.max, do its own thing. Say this, or let's say in this case it's not this.props because it's not a class. Still the same deal. Props now are just passed in as an argument instead. So props is passed in, which means it's not this.props inside of a functional component, it's just props. Props.count is going to show us the number of characters that we've currently typed in. We might want props.max minus props.count, right? You have 140 left, now we're going backwards. So that character counter function is looking pretty complicated now compared to what we can do with this, right? I mean, there's a lot of components and stuff going on, but I'm not really having to grab the value from this thing and then do some then assign it in. I'm just saying that as this data changes, state.content, it will re-render my app, and every time it re-renders my app, it gets the new length, and it passes that into the status bar, and the status bar just uses that value to display the calculated version, right? I can easily change the max. I can just pass in a new value to that, and now it will respond to that. If I went up to 280 characters, I pass 280 into it, and the component does not care. Naive to details of my app are. Later on, I'm going to pass in a props.error. So it's just going to render that error message out. This component I would consider to be pure. Pure means I pass in a set of props, and it returns to me some DOM. And if I pass in that same set of props, no matter what, it will still pass me that same DOM. If I pass in new props, it'll pass me different looking DOM, but that's okay. But that's a pure component, right? It doesn't actually, there's no state in here that would affect the way that this component renders. So props are always the same. The DOM output will. That would be pure component. So I've created this component, and now I want to I pass the current and maximum character count to the status bar as props. In the status bar, I want to render the character counter, changing the style when max is reached. I haven't done that part yet. I am currently updating the number of characters, but it doesn't go red when I hit 0 or negative. It goes red all the time. It's always red. Okay, well that means I'm not actually conditionally formatting it. So inside the status bar, we'll notice that we have this thing called counter over. This is the class that we use. If I don't have over in here, over meaning over the limit, well then it's black. So what over does is just a class text color is red. It overwrites it. So here I want to change this class depending on the props that are passed into this component. I want to do something like if, let's say const remaining equal to props.max minus props.count. So the number of remaining characters. Well, then I may as well just put remaining in here. So if remaining is less than or equal to 0, we just say less than 0. We'll see how it works, right? So if the remaining is less than 0, then we want this thing, we want to let our class, sorry, I can't use, we want this to be the counter, right? And if the remaining is less than 0, then class plus equals space with over in it. So I'm saying I'm gonna create this variable called class. It'll have counter, and we will use that here to define the class name, like so. So now class is going to be whatever this string is. It'll be counter in the case that everything's okay, and it'll go to it'll add the over class as well when we go below 0. So it's black, good. Hit 0, and now it's red. We can conditionally apply styles. We can apply, take that value, write it right to the DOM. I would probably write this a little bit differently. I would say something like const class is equal to, well, if remaining is equal to 0, is less than 0, then I would say I'd probably write it like that instead, kind of like the single line. But I'm saying this is a ternary operator, and these are common in React as well. I would say if the remaining is less than 0, then I want the class to be counter over. Otherwise, I want it to be counter. This should still work exactly the same. I type in here to change this key input. It still works. So that's conditionally applying style dependent on props that are passed in. Because I don't want to change it. I don't need to change it. No, it's not. There's a single assignment made. Yeah, exactly. If I'd done it the other way, I had to use let. So I was taking a value and then modifying it. Here I'm deciding what it is before I do the assignment. That's what I love about this, is that I get to choose which option it is before I do the assignment, and then it will never change after that. That's more a style I like to use, and it's something that's actually come up since I started building stuff in React. Saw other people doing this. I started to use this more. Because what you can't do is you cannot use inside of here. I can't use if inside of here. But I can use ternary operations. So, and I'll show you some conditional rendering with that after, but it is sort of one of the limitations of React is that you can't use an if inside of the right in line with the HTML style stuff. So you tend to use or ternary operators or other ways to do. Which one? Like if you write code, let class equals counter. If you write it like this, and if class, that's totally fine. No one's gonna fault you for that. I just tend to prefer the fewer lines because ultimately what you want is just when you get to this point, you want class to be one or the other. And so what I'm showing here is that class does not change anything. No, I don't that. Whereas here, class could change further, and I don't want that. So we are at, we did set up an event handler to trigger an update to content on input. We did that already. We used the event handler on change, and we modified the state of the header every time. I think that's pretty good for this morning. When we get back, we're going to pass a function to the header so that it can call it when the post is created. And that's sort of when we get into actions, data down, actions up, the actions up part of that. That's how we're going to make it so that app can actually add new messages or posts to the array. We have an hour this afternoon, and there should be no problem getting through this. So what I recommend is, as you're going through this material, obviously ask questions as you're going. But at the beginning, we're going to come back to this. We're going to talk about this. We're going to see if it makes even a little bit more sense for people or not. And then we'll just continue. We'll finish this off so that we can actually add some tweets. And also that we'll get those tweets from the back end. We'll show you how to do AJAX-style requests in React as well. Okay? Is everyone good? Okay. Victoria, good?
Yeah, I already set up this one. That's why I go there, you know.
All right.